Did you find water? Good morning. How do people feel this morning? Have you had a good conference? Have you had a good time? Raise your hand if you've learned something. Raise your hand if you've met somebody you'd like to keep in touch with. Great. That's what we were hoping for. A couple of housekeeping. A lot of you have been asking about the general evaluation. That's going to be emailed to you within the next week. And then you will get your certificate of participation right after you filled out that evaluation. I do have some sad news. Erin Andrews is not going to be here this morning. Her schedule between football and Dancing with the Stars didn't permit, so she sends her regrets. We do have, however, a really wonderful panel this morning, and I think we've had a lot of news about athletes and athletes as offenders. I think that we'll hear from our panel today about their personal stories and also why this seems to be happening more and more. We're first going to hear from Brenda Tracy. Brenda is an advocate, nurse, mother, and survivor. After she was brutally raped by 4 men in 1998, Ms. Tracy reported the crime to the police and underwent an invasive forensic examination. Although law enforcement collected extensive evidence, including confessions from her attackers, the district attorney refused to prosecute her case. Ms. Tracy was never advised of her victim's rights, nor informed when officials destroyed her evidence 3 years prior to the statute of limitations. 16 years later, Ms. Tracy found the courage to come forward and now seeks to make the world a better place for survivors. Ms. Tracy has worked closely with Oregon legislators to expand victims' rights and has successfully helped to pass 5 laws, which includes extending the Oregon statute of limitations to prosecute rape and mandatory testing of all rape kits in Oregon. Ms. Tracy engaged in numerous awareness-raising outreach efforts and is a frequent guest commentator on CNN and ESPN. She travels the country speaking to university students and athletes. Most recently, her story of reuniting with Nebraska football coach Mike Riley, who gave her rapist a 1-game suspension, garnered international media coverage. Brenda is also a paid consultant for the Oregon State University, the very place where her rape occurred. Next, we will be hearing from Belina-Rose Young. Ms. Young is an Evaluation and Translation Fellow for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Her research interests include the development, implementation, and evaluation of sexual violence against women prevention strategies. She was selected by the United Nations Women Champion and has co-led the social media campaign, I Am a Woman. In addition to her research, Belinda consults for national and international universities and nonprofit organizations. Then we will hear from Sarah Desmarais. Dr. Desmarais is an associate professor and coordinator of Applied Social and Community Psychology program at Northern Carolina State University. Dr. Desmarais' program of research lies at the nexus of public health and public safety. Her current work is focused on the development, implementation, and evaluation of assessment and management strategies to reduce risk of violence and crime associated with behavioral health problems. She has more than 70 publications on topics including intersection of violence, victimizations, and mental illness, risk assessments, and domestic violence. She has held over $2.7 million in grants from agencies including the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Desmarais has conducted more than 50 trainings worldwide on risk assessments and management. She serves on the Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice Committees, as well as the State Federal Risk Assessment Task Force. I'm very proud to introduce the panel. And Brenda, why don't you start? You can stay in the chair, or you can.
It's okay, I can stand. Am I on? I am. Hi, everyone. My name is Brenda Tracy. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. As you just heard, in 1998, I was drugged and I was gang raped by 4 men, 4 football players. 2 of those football players went to Oregon State University. I promptly reported my rape. I got a rape kit done. I did everything that a good victim should do to get the wheels of justice rolling. However, victims that come forward and want to prosecute athletes from universities, this doesn't always go well for us. And what I found out 16 years later was that Oregon State University was trying to build a football stadium. And so a rape scandal was not going to bode well for them. And they were concerned with not collecting the amount of money they needed to build the football stadium. So there had to be a decision that was made. And the decision was to build a football stadium and to get me to go away. So I was told I didn't have a good case. I received death threats against myself and my 2 small children at the time. Pretty much everyone turned on me. It's pretty commonplace that we see victims come forward, and then all of a sudden we're also the perpetrator. I was trying to ruin these young men's lives. I was trying to ruin their promising football careers. So everything we see happening today happened to me 20 years ago. So I dropped the charges. I tried to move on with my life. In 2014, I came forward again with my story and found out the horrible details of what had happened. All 4 men had confessed. The DA still refused to prosecute. My rape kit was destroyed and all of my evidence before the statute of limitations was up. So for me, wanting to find healing and still wanting to find justice, I began to identify the issues in my own story. And I tried to figure out how can I prevent the Brenda Tracy story from happening again. Because we see things like the scandal at Baylor where these issues are still happening. And my rape happened 20 years ago. And I think it's disgusting and it's horrible that victims are still going through the same exact thing today. So I'm involved in legislation on a federal level, on a state level. The other thing is I speak, and I've been blessed to be able to travel recently to a bunch of different D1 schools. I've been at Oklahoma, I've talking to the football team, I've been to Baylor to talk to the football team. I went to Nebraska where I met with Coach Riley, who in 1998 gave my rapist a 1-game suspension and went on record in the newspaper and said, these are good guys who made a bad choice. So I had the opportunity to speak with him at length about his impact on my life, how his handling of my case affected me, and then spoke with the football team. So for me, I think this idea of athletic culture and the crimes that we're seeing, I get the statistics tell us that student population athletes make up a small portion of the entire school's population, but they're committing more of these crimes at a higher rate. And I get that. Now that I'm in this and I'm doing this work, I see number one, the way we're socializing our men and our boys. This is the first thing we have to address. We have to address how we're not allowing our young boys to have emotions, to have feelings. We are immediately telling them, don't act like a girl, don't do anything feminine, don't do anything that would make you seem like you're gay, which really just leaves them to do things like be angry, be tough, be a man. You know, things like you throw like a girl is a huge insult. So we have those things. Then when we identify that a young man has athletic ability, then all of a sudden we put this entitlement on him. And I've seen this. I have my own sons. I was an athlete when I was younger too. And With my own boys, I saw that when they were identified as athletes in about probably 5th grade, all of a sudden they got to do things other kids didn't get to do. So maybe they weren't doing as well in class and they got a pass on it. Same thing through high school and everything else. So I watched it unfold, and we do this to these young men. So when we get them into college, they feel entitled. They feel like a woman's body is something that they're owed, something that they can just have. It's their right to do what they want. They know that they have a system around them that will protect them, that won't hold them accountable. They've bought into the myths, and all of us play a part in that. The university plays a part in it. I walk into these D1 schools, and what the first thing I realize is when I walk in, is I walk into some of these athletic facilities, and I think, of course they feel entitled. I'm walking into this state-of-the-art facility where every single need, desire, want is met. They're being fed, they're being literally catered, food, any injury, any class they're having a problem with, there's a tutor. They're having these great meals separated in a facility away from pretty much everyone else because they kind of live in their own little world on campus. And then you have another student that's eating top ramen in their dorm room. There's a huge disparity going on our campuses. And part of me is like, of course these men feel like this. Look what they're living in. It's like a fantasy land. So those are things that we have to talk about. But for me, college is a little late to be able to dismantle all the myths and the things that have been ingrained in them their whole lives. I think we need to start looking at junior high and high school when we're talking about respect education and consent education and that kind of thing. But for me, what I try to do is I do what I can at the college level. And I think what we can do at the college level is we can talk about bystander intervention. We can talk about young men policing each other. And so when I speak to these men, I talk to the football team. I talk to them about what's going on in our culture. I put a face to the victims. I talk about my story. I tell them in graphic detail what has happened to me. And then I talk to them about how they can become engaged. And the response has been really good. When I say to them, if women could end sexual assault and domestic violence, we would have already done it. They kind of look at me like, oh, huh. And then when I say to them, you're the answer, right? If you're the good guy, if you're the one that's not perpetrating these crimes, and you're the one that I need to stand up, you're the one that I need to start policing everyone else and helping everyone else and keeping your eyes open, then they, again, are kind of like, huh, I guess I could do something. Because for the most part, most of these men are thinking, well, I'm not a rapist. I'm not doing anything wrong. This is not my problem. So I don't need to do anything. And what I'm telling them is you are the solution. You are the answer. I'm not going to go on a campus and change a sociopath's mind. And there are men on our campuses who are sociopaths. They're going to rape. We're not going to be able to probably stop them unless we start really getting clear about what we need to be doing on our campuses with these men. But there are the good kids that we can engage and mobilize to start policing and looking out for others and holding other people accountable. So that education, I think, on our college level is really important, and I try my best to do that, and the feedback has been good. Every time I leave a school, I have men tweeting at me afterwards, rape is a men's issue, and I'm gonna do my part to get involved. So I see them wanting to get involved, but it's a matter of having a conversation where we're inviting them and not indicting them. And that's really what I try to do. And I think that's why I've been successful. I think that's why coaches keep asking me to come to their schools and talk to them. I have one-on-ones with the coaches. We talk about consent. We talk about why is alcohol an excuse for rape, but it's not for drunk driving or any other crime? Why is the only crime excusable rape when it has to do with alcohol? So I try to reframe their ideas also, because these are the men who are also molding our boys on these teams. So that's some of the work that I'm doing and I'm trying to work on. But again, I think we really we need to focus on our younger people, because for the most part, it's too late once we get to college. And like I said, I think the only thing at that level we can do is engage men to try to kind of police each other and do bystander intervention, kind of, buy into the entitlement and the privilege a little bit. I talked to them about how you have a unique platform, you are separate on this campus, you are treated differently. So what you do, other people are gonna look at you and they're gonna do the same thing. If the football team says this is what we're doing, then that's what everybody else is gonna do. So I do try to use what I can to get them to engage and to mobilize. And I think the presenters coming up are probably gonna validate a lot of what I've just said. But that's what I'm doing right now, and I would encourage all of you to do the same, to try to focus on the men that want to be a part of this change. Let's try to engage them, educate them, mobilize them, concentrate on some bystander and consent education in colleges, but then also let's start getting to our younger kids, because that's where we're going to start seeing the change, 10 years down the road. That's when we're going to see the 1 in 5 number get better. So thank you for allowing me a few minutes to just kind of introduce myself and let you know what I'm doing. And I appreciate all of you and the work that you're doing. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves. You guys are invaluable. I couldn't do the work I'm doing without you. I recognize that the system doesn't always work, but it's people like you and me that are going to change the system. And so I'm just so happy to see you all here, and I value you and I appreciate you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here to speak to you today to talk about something that's incredibly near and dear to my heart. But before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors on the paper that I'm going to talk to you about today. They are Dr. Sarah Desmarais, which you'll hear from after me, Drs. Julie Baldwin and Rashida Chandler. So there's 3 main questions that I want to answer today in the context of collegiate athletic sexual violence perpetration. They are, what do we know? What can we do about it? And what resources are available to me as an organization? So the research tells us that nearly 1 in 5 American women have been raped. And of those women, 37.4% of them were first assaulted during their collegiate years. We also know that just by sheer fact that you go to college as a woman, that you're at higher risk for being sexually victimized compared to your non-collegiate peers. Also, research tells us that rape is underreported for a number of different factors, so in actuality, these numbers are much larger. With regards to sexual violence perpetration, the first paper that actually put together the connection between athletes and sexual violence victimization was Melnick back in 1992. Now, there were some other papers that documented instances, but this was the first individual to say, there's a problem going on here. So after this, a series of publications came out in the 1990s and early 2000s. One of them was by Crosette in 1995, in which he surveyed the judicial records of 30 NCAA Division I schools. And from his findings, he saw that although the athletes comprised 3% of the population, it accounted for over 19% of the perpetration. On the slide, you'll see some sexual violence risk factors that we have from literature. This is not exhaustive. This is only a few, but there's some that I want to highlight with regards to athletics. If you look at the second one, aggression. We know that athletes have to be aggressive. That's what they're told. That's what they're pumped up to be. To be a good football player, you have to be willing to take a sack, right? You can't just be timid on the field. Attitudes towards women. These are the beliefs in traditional gender roles and looking at women as being inferior or that they have to be docile. So I played sports growing up. I played soccer. And I didn't really think about this as a young girl, But now that I'm older and I'm doing this research, I understand. There are times where a coach will come up behind you, whether male or female, smack you on the butt, but especially as a male athlete, they might call you by a girl's name. Come on, Susie, get it together. Well, what is that really saying? That women are inferior? When we look at the last side, rape myth acceptance, these are the beliefs that assaultive situations are not rape. So when you have people that ask, well, what was she wearing? Was it short? Was it tight? Well, clearly she wanted it. She wasn't really raped. That's rape myth acceptance. So with regards to our paper, we saw that some of these risk factors and also the environment itself was not just present in intercollegiate athletics, which is what research is really focused on, but in recreational athletics. And let me point out that recreational athletes tend to be the largest group of athletes on any given campus. So we decided to create a survey, and this survey included 3 different scales that asked about rape myth acceptance, their attitudes towards women, and also if they had been sexually coercive. Now, with regards to sexual coercion, it wasn't just physical sexual coercion, which is horrible. It's use of force and use of weaponry, but also verbal sexual coercion. So use of threats, lies. And we went into recruiting these athletes. We then reviewed the sample size. We had over 190 athletes participate in our survey. And what we did is we created a comparable subsample. So from the non-athletes, we created a subsample that was comparable based on demographics in order to see how they compare against the non-athletes. And then we conducted some analyses, which I'll go into right now. So for our first set of analyses, we grouped together the intercollegiate athletes and recreational athletes and made them one group. And we compared them against non-athletes. And we found that athletes had higher beliefs in gender roles, higher rape myth acceptance, and higher rates of sexual coercion. These are people admitting that they have verbally and physically sexually coerced someone. Then we took it a step further than what literature has ever done. And we looked at intercollegiate athletes versus recreational athletes. And we found that there is no difference. So they have the same rates of sexual coercion, they have the same beliefs about traditional gender roles, and they also have the same amount of beliefs in terms of rape myth acceptance. Following this, we conducted what was called a mediation analysis. So we know that athletes have higher risk for sexual coercion. But what we did is we looked at attitudes towards women and rape myth acceptance, and we were able to show that athletes have a higher risk for perpetrating sexual coercion because of their rape myths of acceptance and attitudes towards women. We also saw that amongst non-athletes and athletes, there were high rates of verbal sexual coercion. And this is something that sometimes people sweep under the rug and say, well, they just threatened her. It wasn't a big deal. But from research, we know that verbal sexual coercion is a pathway to physical sexual coercion. So based upon our findings, we had a couple of recommendations. One, that there be continuous verbal sexual coercion for all undergraduate males. And we know that should be continuous because if we want something that's going to be long-lasting, you need more than just one dosage. Also, with regards to rape myth acceptance and attitudes towards women, that recreational athletes now be involved in sexual violence education, and also their coaches in case they also have those high-risk attitudes. Lastly, from research, we know that Division I athletes are at higher risk than any other division for perpetrating sexual violence. And part of that is explained by the protective nature of athletics. So for our policy recommendations, we want to integrate athletes more into the student body, which is something that Brenda touched on earlier, and having consistent and strict assault allegation protocols. So a lot of the work that we've done in research has been at the individual level, but sexual violence is a societal problem, although it occurs between individuals, because there's societal issues that contribute to sexual violence, like weak laws and policies. And though I'm proud of the research that we're doing, there's much that we need to do. So today I address you as colleagues. Whether you're working with a nonprofit, law enforcement, whether you're an individual that's just interested in sexual violence prevention, there's much that we can do together. Okay, you might ask, Brenda, well, what can we do? Well, part of it is intentional collaboration. Being intentional about who and how you collaborate, whether that's working with people in media or using social media, working with universities and colleges. If you're near a university, there's probably a researcher that's doing some kind of work in violence. And let me put a personal plug here for CDC. They have a publication called Connecting the Dots. What's phenomenal about this publication, if you're not familiar with it, again, Connecting the Dots, is that it outlines all the different types of violences and the different predictors that overlap. So say a researcher has money to do suicide prevention. Well, we also know that's a cause, that's a concern for those who have been sexually victimized. So you could do work on both with the same pot of money. You can also work with athletic organizations looking for common ground. Although we're all passionate about sexual violence perpetration, we have to be mindful that not every coach, not every athlete is our opponent. So looking for a common ground with coaches that can help. And of course, the individuals in this room. This is a captive audience. You can look to your left and to your right and work with individuals. I'm a strong believer that passion needs perseverance. Passion needs perseverance. And working with individuals in this room will help us to persevere. So what are some resources? Well, these slides will be made available to you through the mobile app, so I'm not going to go through all of these by any means. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but in this list, you'll see different e-learning modules that could be helpful for you or any of your partners. You'll also find technical packages that can help you evaluate your work. And there's other links that have suggestions for campaigns that you can use as well. Even if your organization doesn't squarely focus on sexual violence advocacy, prevention advocacy, a lot of these links will be helpful to you. There's also financial resources, and again, I won't go through that. Now, I know that the thought of tackling sexual violence prevention can be a daunting task, but there's much that we can do here, just with the people in this room. I will be available afterwards if you have any questions or if you want to talk anymore, but I'm incredibly hopeful for all that we can accomplish. Thank you.
So I'm going to be wrapping up with some slides on what are some evidence-based strategies to prevent sexual violence associated with athletic culture. And it's incredibly empowering to be up here and to see people share their stories, and also to see fabulous young researchers who are going out there into the world to try to make a difference. And I know that this has been a long conference and a very intense experience for people, so I'm hoping that today I'm going to leave you with 3 take-home messages. They'll be crystal clear and speak to ways that we can concretely move forward. So I wanted to start with a bit of an introduction into what do we mean by prevention, and what do we really need to do to be able to prevent a sexually violent act. And I'm really going to pick up here from what Brenda was talking about in her talk. I'm also going to review some research on what we know about programs that actually work, and even some programs that might actually make things worse. So we're going to go through and talk about a few of those, and then give you some guidance on how do I actually pick from the many different programs that are out there. So by way of introduction, I want to get crystal clear about what we mean by prevention. When we talk about prevention, usually what we're talking about is primary prevention, stopping it before it starts. This is proactive. It means that there hasn't been an identified risk or behavior, and we want to try to stop the violence before it occurs. What we tend to see more of is this reactive secondary prevention. And this is where we start with an identified group who is at higher risk or a behavior that's emerging, and then we try to respond to this sexual violence risk. The third and most common legal form of prevention is tertiary. This is reactive. This is after a serious incident of sexual violence. This is then what we do as a society, as a criminal justice system, as a healthcare system to respond to those victims if and whether they come forward. So I want you to keep this in mind because it really changes how we might actually do work to prevent sexual violence in athletics. What we know from the psychological literature is that adolescents and college students don't show up on campus as blank slates. They actually have most of their attitudes and behaviors well formed. And what we know from the broader literature in crime and violence is that a lot of this behavior emerges in early adolescence. And so again, just like Brenda was talking about, it's about reaching these students before they show up and become part of the athletic culture. And so Terry Moffat's work back from many years ago now, from 1993, really helped us delineate those students who are starting to engage in behaviors that might be what we called adolescence delimited. So here that they're going to engage in some of these behaviors. They might do some things that are emerging as sexually violent. It might be verbally sexually violent, but they will actually age out of those behaviors. We want to be able to find those kids early and help them stay in that adolescence delimited track and not become what we know as life course persistent assaulters. And so this really fits then well with what we see on college campuses. We know that a good almost 2/3 of male college students don't actually perpetrate sexual assault. But of those that do, 35% report perpetrating their first assault before they show up on college campuses. And another 6% report starting in this behavior once they get to campus. So another way to think about this is that 80% of male college athletes who are perpetrating sexually violent behavior start that behavior before they even show up at the university. And so what we need to do is get those kids early. So my first take-home message for you is going to be that we need to get these kids before they show up at college campuses. So how do we do that? How do we get to them before they show up and become part of the university athletic culture? So far in the research, we've actually only been able to identify 3 effective strategies. These are 3 programs that have shown to reduce sexual violence when implemented properly. The first one is called Safe Dates, and this is a universal dating violence program. So it really does focus on behaviors that occur in relationships as opposed to between strangers. But the messages and the skills that they learn actually really translate well across interpersonal interactions. You'll notice here that it's not just a one-off. It's a 10-session strategy. It focuses on attitudes, social norms, and relationship skills. It's multimodal. They do all sorts of different types of learning and activities. And that's going to be a recurring theme for these effective programs. Another one is known as shifting boundaries, and this one actually has 2 components. It has an individual level one and a universal school-based strategy. And you'll see in a minute, the individual level one actually doesn't seem to work very well. But when we attack this on a school level with, again, middle school students, we seem to be able to change the culture that these students are experiencing. So here we have 6 sessions in class, and it really focuses here on that outer level, the policy level. The last one that seems to be very effective in reducing sexual violence rates is actually a policy. So it's the U.S. Violence Against Women Act. They were able to show that this was associated with changes in the level of sexual assault. And this is a really important one to keep in mind. That is not just about us at the individual level. We have to get up to the legislatures. So one thing I hope that you picked up is that none of these were actually focused on student athletes or the athletic culture. What is a critical driving area of need right now is that we don't have effective programs that are targeting these individuals. We'll come back to that in a minute. So there are 4 programs that seem really promising, but have not yet actually shown differences in sexual violence. So these don't have that effectiveness in terms of rates yet, but they do seem to be very effective in changing the risk factors, so the attitudes and the precursors to engaging in those behaviors. One is coaching boys into men, and here this is the first and only program that I'm going to talk about that is focused on student athletes. And this is really getting the coaches into the experience, and it's one-on-one mentoring between coaches and students. One thing I think, I hope you'll see there too is, again, this is not a one-off session. This requires a lot of what we call in the treatment world dosage. The next thing is one called Second Step. And here again, this is a long-term program focused at the middle school base. The last 2 I want to mention together because they're both known as bystander prevention programs or bystander intervention programs. And this is what Brenda was talking about earlier that seems to be working on college campuses. That this is where we can get other students and peers involved in calling and reporting on behaviors in the hopes that we can change the social norms. So these are very promising. We just don't have the research yet to show that they change sexual violence rates. I wanted to also highlight 3 different programs that actually seem to have potentially harmful effects, with the caveat that we don't know why they're potentially harmful. It is quite possible that they look to be harmful, meaning that they increase sexual violence rates, because more victims are actually reporting as a result of these programs. So it's not to say that the program is increasing sexual violence necessarily, but we just don't see the reductions associated with them. So the first is really focused on law and justice curriculum. And so this is actually a very common component of a lot of sexual violence prevention programs, but there is absolutely no data to show that educating people on what legally constitutes rape helps reduce rape. Rather than teaching them what's illegal, why don't we teach them what is wrong and what is right? This next one is a bystander intervention approach that just doesn't seem quite as effective as the other 2 bystander intervention programs, and again, seems to have actually increased rates of reporting. And the last one I wanted to highlight, because this is what we see most often used with college students and with student athletes in particular. These are videos. So they show a one-time video, it might be 50 minutes long, and this is supposed to change how our students think and feel and act. And that's just ridiculous. We know from the intervention work and the evidence-based prevention research that this is not a strategy for sustainable long-term change. And so this is something that, yes, you can absolutely use a video, but there definitely needs to be a curriculum that goes along with it. So I've gone through these rather quickly. They will be available to you in the handouts, but I wanted to also talk a little bit about then how do you pick a particular program for your setting or your group. So there are about 4 different things that I advise, and this is really why my phone rings. People call me to ask me what they should implement in a given setting. So the first thing you absolutely want to do is look at the evidence base. Is there research to suggest that it changes the behavior you're interested in? And so if you're interested in reducing sexual violence, is there data to show that that works? The second here is to really think about the program design and content. And a few things that we've been talking about throughout this session is the need for it to be comprehensive. So it's not just focusing on one risk factor. It's not just focusing on attitudes. It might focus on attitudes and social norms and interpersonal interactions. It should be theory-driven, so there should be a reason why this should work. use varied teaching methods. So instead of just sort of having a bunch of students sit in a room and listen to you, which I know as a university professor is very ineffective, we should have them engage in role playing. They should watch videos. They should engage in all sorts of different strategies to make use of that information. It has to have a lot of what we call dosage, meaning that a one-off intervention, though really attractive from a cost point of view, is probably not going to work. We need to have repeated exposure to the information, repeated opportunity to engage in these kind of role modeling types of actions. And then the last thing that really seems to matter is this modeling of positive relationships. And in terms of athletic culture, this is where other athletes and coaches come into play. There should be a match with the target population. So think about the timing. Are we going to time this to get at the middle and high school students? Or is this curriculum going to be more or less appropriate for a college population? Also think about the actors. We have 3 potential actors that we can target here. We can target potential victims, we can target potential bystanders, and we can target potential perpetrators. And my feeling is that we have to do all 3 of those things, but if we're going to truly achieve prevention, we need to be targeting the potential perpetrators. The last thing that I wanted to mention is some real practical stuff, like how much is this going to cost? You could have a fantastic program, but if you don't have the funds to pay for and sustain this program over time, it's not going to be effective, and you're not going to see reductions in sexual violence. You also need to make sure that there's appropriate training. You can find a lot of programs online, but if you don't have a staff that is appropriately trained to deliver this program, again, you're not going to be able to achieve that end goal of preventing sexual violence. And then the last thing is that you actually need to check whether it's working. And this is where evaluation comes into play. And it doesn't necessarily require a big randomized controlled trial where somebody like me comes in to help you guys evaluate it, but rather just to start monitoring changes over time. Are there changes in reporting rates? Are there changes in attitudes? So the last take-home message I leave you with is the need for implementing and evaluating programs that are specifically targeting this athletic culture. Thanks.
Thank you all for sharing your information, and Brenda, particularly thank you for your bravery to tell us your story. We have a little time for questions, and we have 2 mic runners in the back. So if we have any questions for staff, for our panel, we'd be very happy to take them. Back there.
Check, check.
Hi there. Can you tell me if you're familiar with the curriculum Girl Circle Council for Young Men, and do you feel like it's effective?
Can you repeat the name of that one, please?
Girl Circle Council for Young Men?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything report on whether or not it is effective in terms of a rigorous evaluation, but it does seem to map onto a lot of the core curriculum ideas that seem to map here. So the thing that I would always say is with these programs is not to say that one that hasn't been evaluated isn't going to work, but rather look at whether or not it seems to fit those sort of criteria for what a good program looks like.
Others? Okay. Well, can we have another round of applause for our panel? Well, this concludes the National Center for Victims of Crime Conference 2016. I want to thank you all for coming and for participating and being such a wonderful audience. Please be safe and careful on your way home, and good luck and good futures, and hopefully we'll see you next year in Portland. Take care.